I need to tell you about the night everything I thought I knew about silence became a lie. It was late October in the Montana high country, the kind of evening where the cold settles into your bones before you even notice it creeping through the cracks of the barn walls. I'd lived alone on that farm for 17 years by then, and I knew every sound the land made, the way the wind moved through the pines, the groan of settling timber, the skittering of field mice in the loft. But that night, there was a storm that made no sound at all. No thunder, no rain drumming on the roof, just an electrical pressure in the air that made my teeth ache and turned the sky a color I still don't have words for. Somewhere between bruised violet and the green you see right before a tornado touches down. I watched it from my kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands. And when the light finally faded, I felt something in my chest pull tight, like a fishhook caught behind my ribs. I should have stayed inside. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to lock the doors and wait for morning. But instead, I pulled on my coat and walked out to the barn, following a compulsion I couldn't name, drawn by something that felt older than reason itself. The barn door was open. I know I'd closed it. I close it every night without fail because the hinges are loud and I can't sleep if I think I've left something undone. But there it was, swaying slightly on its track, and the darkness inside seemed thicker than it should have been, almost textured, like I could reach out and touch the absence of light. I grabbed the flashlight from the nail by the door frame and stepped inside, and that's when I smelled it, not unpleasant, but completely unfamiliar, like ozone mixed with something organic, earth after the first rain, maybe, or the inside of a split geoda. My beam swept across the familiar landscape of hay bales and tools, and the old tractor I kept meaning to fix, and then it landed on the corner near the empty horse stall. At first, I thought it was a child. That was the only frame of reference my mind could grab onto, small, maybe 3 feet tall, curled on its side in a position that looked wrong, too angular, limbs bent in ways that made my stomach turn. But then I saw the skin smooth and pale, almost translucent, with a faint luminescence underneath, like there was light trapped beneath the surface trying to get out. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They opened as my light hit them, huge and dark and reflective, no white at all, just depthless black that somehow still caught and held the beam. And in that moment I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before, like every secret I'd ever kept was laid bare in an instant. I should have run. I should have called someone. Though who would I call and what would I even say? But I didn't do either of those things. Instead, I knelt down slowly, the way you approach an injured animal, and saw that I somehow knew it was he was badly hurt. There was a wound along his side that didn't bleed red but something darker, almost black, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. His hand, if you could call it that, 3 fingers and a thumb, longer than they should be, reached toward me slightly, and then fell back, exhausted. I remember thinking with perfect clarity that this moment was a hinge, that my life was splitting into before and after, and whatever I did next would define which version of myself I became. The rational part of my brain was cataloging all the reasons to leave, to forget, to pretend I'd never seen this. But there was another voice, quieter but stronger, that said this being had been delivered to me for a reason, that the silent storm and the open door and the pull I'd felt were all part of something that had been in motion long before I was born. So I made a choice that defied every reasonable instinct the first possessed. I went to the house, gathered blankets and water, and the veterinary supplies I kept for the livestock, and I came back, and I decided, against all logic and self-preservation, to hide him and try to keep him alive. That was 10 years ago. And now, as I sit here trying to put into words what happened in the decade that followed, I realize that the hardest part isn't describing what I saw or what I learned. It's explaining how something so impossible became the most real thing in my life, how a being from somewhere beyond my comprehension became my closest friend, my teacher, my mirror, and how, in trying to save him, I discovered that he'd been trying to save me all along, not just me, but all of us from something we can't yet see coming, but that casts its shadow backward through time. This is my testimony. This is what I need you to understand before it's too late, before the skepticism and the fear make you turn away from the only truth that matters anymore. I met someone in my barn that night who changed everything, and now I have to tell you why that changes everything for you too. The first 3 years were an education in patience I didn't know I needed, a dismantling of everything I thought communication required. Liar, I gave him that name in the second month after finding it in an old book about light, because that's what he reminded me of. Something luminous trapped in flesh couldn't speak, or wouldn't. I was never sure which. His mouth would open sometimes, revealing a structure inside that seemed designed for sounds my ears might not be able to process. But no words came. Instead, he watched me with those impossible eyes, and I watched him back, and slowly, impossibly slowly, we built a language out of necessity and desperation. It started with drawings. I'd sketch something simple in the dirt floor of the barn, a cup, a blanket, food, and he'd nod or shake his head, gestures that were apparently universal. But then he began drawing. Back, his three-fingered hands moving with a precision that made my crude stick figures look like the work of a child. He drew patterns that I first mistook for decoration but later realized were maps, not of places, but of relationships, showing how things connected in ways I'd never considered. A tree wasn't just a tree in his drawings, it was the soil, the water table beneath it, the fungal network spreading through the earth, the insects that lived in its bark, the birds that nested in its branches, all rendered as a single flowing system. He was showing me that everything I saw as separate was actually continuous, that the boundaries I'd drawn around objects were arbitrary, human constructs that blinded me to the deeper truth of how the world actually worked. As his wounds healed with agonizing slowness, that dark substance gradually fading to something clearer, almost silver, I began to notice changes in myself, in how I perceived the land I'd lived on for nearly 2 decades. He'd take my hand sometimes, his skin cool and smooth like river stones, and press my palm against the barn wall or the trunk of a tree, and I'd feel something I can only describe as a vibration, not sound but a frequency that moved through matter itself. At first I thought I was imagining it, the power of suggestion, but then I started sensing it without his touch, recognizing patterns in the way birds moved before a storm, understanding somehow that the coyotes were changing their territory because the water sources were shifting underground, seeing the forest not as individual trees, but as a vast conversation happening in slow motion. Lyre would watch me during these moments of recognition with something that looked like satisfaction, or maybe relief, and I realized he was teaching me to perceive the way he did, giving me a vocabulary I'd been missing my entire life. We'd sit together in the evenings, him wrapped in blankets because his body temperature ran cooler than mine, and I'd bring him things from the property, leaves, stones, insects preserved in jars, and he'd arrange them in patterns that told stories I was only beginning to read. Once he laid out a sequence of pine cones, acorns, and seed pods in a spiral, then touched each one and looked at me with an urgency I couldn't miss, and suddenly I understood he was showing me time, how it moved in cycles rather than lines, how everything that had happened was still happening somewhere, how the future was already present in the patterns of the now. In the 3rd year, I noticed he was changing in a way that defied everything I understood about biology and growth. He was getting smaller, not weaker, exactly, but more compact, more delicate, as if he was condensing rather than diminishing. His movements became more economical, more precise, and his eyes, already too large for his face, seemed to take up even more space. Wells of darkness that I sometimes caught my reflection in, distorted and strange. At first I thought I was losing him, that whatever had injured him was finally taking its toll, and I felt a panic I hadn't experienced since my wife died. That same sense of watching something precious slip through my fingers while I stood helpless. But Lyre sensed my fear. He always did. And one evening he took both my hands and pressed them to his chest, and I felt his heart, or whatever served that function, beating in a rhythm that was slowing down, becoming more spaced out, deliberate. Then he drew a picture I'll never forget, a human figure growing from child to adult to elder, the normal arrow of time, and beside it, his own form moving in the opposite direction, from larger to smaller, adult to child to something even more elemental. He was showing me that his species experienced time backward from us, or maybe perpendicular to us, aging in reverse as they moved through their lives, returning to source rather than moving away from it. It was then that I understood the depth of what had fallen into my barn. That night, not just an injured traveler, but a being whose entire relationship to existence was fundamentally alien to mine, who lived in a universe that operated by rules I was only beginning to glimpse. I started keeping journals during those years, filling notebook after notebook with sketches and observations, trying to capture what I was learning before it slipped away from me. I drew the way frost formed on the windows in patterns that matched the veins and leaves, the way water flowed Round stones in the creek using the same mathematics as galaxies spiraling in space. The way Lear's drawings kept pointing to this underlying unity that connected everything from the smallest atom to the largest structure one could imagine. I was a mediocre student in school, barely made it through high school, never thought of myself as someone who'd understand anything complex or profound. But Lyre was teaching me to see that intelligence wasn't about accumulating facts. It was about recognizing relationships, patterns, the invisible threads that bound the world together. He'd watch me work in the fields sometimes, from the barn window, and I'd feel his attention like a physical touch. And I'd start noticing things I'd missed for years: how certain plants grew stronger when they were near each other, how the soil spoke different languages in different areas, how the land itself had memory encoded in layers of sediment and root systems. My neighbors, the few times I saw them, started commenting that my crops looked different, healthier, that something about my property had changed, and I'd just shrug and change the subject, because how could I explain that I was learning agriculture from a being who understood plants as conscious participants in a vast exchange rather than resources to be extracted? Those 3 years reshaped me at a fundamental level. Took a lonely, isolated man who'd been sleepwalking through existence and woke him up to a world infinitely stranger and more beautiful than anything I'd imagined. And at the center of it all was this small, luminous being who was slowly growing younger while teaching me, finally, how to truly see. By the 4th year, Lyre had become small enough that I could lift him with one arm, light as a child of 5 or 6, though his proportions remained distinctly non-human, all elongated limbs and that oversized head that seemed to contain more thoughts than any skull should hold. He moved through the barn like water now, fluid and purposeful, and I'd often wake before dawn to find him standing at the window, watching the sky with an intensity that made my chest ache with questions I couldn't form into words. The backward aging wasn't gradual anymore, it was accelerating, as if time had decided to collect its debt all at once. I'd measure him against the barn wall, where I'd marked his height, watching the line descend month by month, and each measurement felt like a countdown to something I wasn't ready to face. He seemed aware of it too, this quickening, and his teachings became more urgent, more complex, as if he was racing to show me everything before he became too small, too young, to transform, to continue. I'd find him arranging objects in increasingly elaborate, patterned stones, and bones and dried flowers forming geometric shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly, configurations that seemed to fold space around them in ways that made the air shimmer and bend. When I'd ask what they meant, he'd take my hand and press it to the center of these arrangements, and I'd feel something like memory that wasn't mine, images flooding through me of landscapes that had never existed on Earth, or perhaps had existed so long ago that the continents themselves had forgotten. The land started responding to his presence in ways that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with a strange wonder that bordered on religious feeling, though I'd never been a man for churches or prayer. Plants grew differently near the barn, their leaves orienting toward it even when the sun was in the opposite direction, as if Lyre emanated something they recognized as nourishment or instruction. I'd find mushroom rings appearing overnight in perfect circles, and when I stepped inside them, I'd hear sounds at the edge of perception, almost like voices singing in frequencies my ears weren't designed to catch. The animals changed to deer would stand at the property line at dusk, watching the barn with an intelligence in their eyes that made me uncomfortable. And once I saw a fox sitting directly outside the door, motionless for hours, as if keeping vigil. Lyre would watch these gatherings with what I can only describe as sadness, his large eyes reflecting the creatures back at themselves, and through our shared visual language, he showed me that they remembered him, or remembered his kind, from a time before humans had claimed dominion, when the world operated by agreements we'd since forgotten or violated. He drew pictures of vast forests covering continents, of animals and beings living in partnership rather than hierarchy, of humans who still knew how to listen to the languages spoken in root systems and wind patterns. Then he'd draw fire, spreading across everything, and humans multiplying like cells dividing, and the other beings retreating or disappearing. And I understood he was showing me the cost of our success, the price of our forgetting. In the 5th year, Lyre began to sleep more, curled into himself like a cat, and when he was awake, his movements had a dreamlike quality, as if he was only partially present in the barn with me, the rest of him drifting through times and places I couldn't access. I'd wake in the night to find him standing over me, his hand hovering above my forehead, and I'd feel something like cool water flowing through my thoughts, organizing memories I'd buried or ignored. He was doing something to my mind, I realized. Not erasing or implanting, but rather clearing away the static and interference that accumulates over decades of human living, the lies we tell ourselves, the traumas we wall off, the truths we pretend not to know. I should have been afraid of this violation, this intimacy that went deeper than physical touch. But instead I felt grateful, relieved, as if I'd been carrying weight I didn't know I'd been holding. During these sessions, fragments would surface, strange dreams from childhood, nights when I'd wake in different positions than I'd fallen asleep in, marks on my skin that had no explanation, a persistent sense throughout my life that I was forgetting something crucial, something that would make sense of everything else. Liar would watch. These memories emerge with recognition, nodding slowly, and I began to suspect that whatever connection we had, it hadn't started 3 years ago in the storm. It went deeper, further back, into a past I'd somehow lost access to, and he was gently, carefully, helping me remember what had been taken or hidden. By the 6th year, he was the size of a toddler, his features softening into something even more otherworldly, less humanoid, as if the human-adjacent appearance had been something he wore for my benefit, and was now discarding as unnecessary. His skin took on a translucence that let me see structures, moving beneath the surface, not organs exactly, but patterns of light that pulsed and flowed like luminous blood. He stopped eating entirely, sustaining himself on something I couldn't provide or understand, though he'd still sit with me during my meals, watching with those fathomless eyes while I chewed and swallowed, studying the mundane act as if it contained mysteries worth contemplating. Our communication had evolved beyond drawings. Now when he touched me, I'd receive entire concepts, whole narratives compressed into single moments of contact, and I'd understand things about physics and biology and consciousness that I had no vocabulary for, knowledge that dissolved into feeling because words were too slow, too limited to contain what he was sharing. He showed me that size was arbitrary, that consciousness wasn't tied to mass, that what I thought of as solid matter was mostly empty space held together by agreements and forces that were themselves just patterns of information. He was preparing me for something. I could feel it. Some revelation that required me to first understand how little I actually understood, how much larger and stranger the universe was than the small corner I'd inhabited. And as he grew smaller, and I felt time accelerating towards some convergence, I realized with absolute certainty that my entire life had been leading to this barn, this being, this impossible education in everything I'd been taught to dismiss as fantasy or madness. It happened on a Tuesday in early March, 7 years to the week since I'd found him in the barn, when Liar took my hand with both of his tiny ones, and I felt the world dissolve. Not metaphorically, I mean the barn actually disappeared around me, replaced by something so vast and incomprehensible that my mind tried to reject it entirely, to wake up, to pretend this was just a dream brought on by isolation and stress. But Liar held firm, his grip impossibly strong for something now no larger than an infant, and I felt him steadying me, anchoring me as the vision expanded. I was standing in a corridor that stretched beyond the limits of perspective, walls that curved in geometries that shouldn't have been possible, glowing with their own interior light that was neither warm nor cold, but something outside temperature entirely. The scale was wrong, everything too large and too small simultaneously, and I realized with a lurching nausea that I was seeing a ship, a vessel, something designed to move through spaces that weren't just physical distance, and I wasn't alone. I could sense others, thousands of them, presences sleeping in chambers that line the impossible hallways like cells in a vast honeycomb, each one containing a human body suspended in time, preserved in moments that hadn't ended so much as paused indefinitely. Liar guided me deeper into the vision, and I understood somehow that these weren't strangers. These were people taken from Earth across decades, centuries maybe, pulled from their lives at moments of crisis or selection by criteria I couldn't grasp. I saw them in their chambers, men and women and children from every era, some wearing clothes I recognized from history books, others in garments I'd seen in old family photographs, and still others in modern dress that could have been from last year or last week. Their faces were peaceful, untortured, as if they'd simply stepped from one moment into another without the violence I'd always imagined abduction entailed. I moved past chamber after chamber, drawn by Lear's will, and then I saw her, my sister, Sarah, who'd disappeared when I was 8 years old, vanished from our backyard during a barbecue, while 30 people stood around talking and grilling, and nobody saw anything. She floated in her chamber exactly as I remembered her, 11 years old, wearing the denim overalls with the sunflower patch, her hair in the same braids my mother had woven that morning, and I felt something break open in my chest that I'd kept sealed for 47 years. She wasn't dead, wasn't suffering, wasn't reduced to bones in some shallow grave. She was here, preserved, waiting, and the decades of grief that had shaped my entire life suddenly inverted into something I had no name for, some emotion between relief and rage and wonder so profound I couldn't breathe. The vision shifted, responding to my shock, and Lyre showed me the why. I saw Earth from orbit, beautiful and blue and swirled with clouds, and then I saw it changing, the changes too fast, time accelerating, ice melting, oceans rising, weather patterns collapsing into chaos. I saw cities swallowed by water, crops failing across continents, masses of people moving like tides away from coasts and toward interiors that couldn't sustain them. I saw the temperature climbing, feedback loops triggering other feedback loops, systems collapsing into other systems, and through it all I saw Lyres, people watching, observing, calculating with their non-linear perception of time that let them see outcomes before the choices that caused them had been made. They'd seen this coming for centuries, this extinction event that humans were creating degree by degree, decision by decision, and they'd made a choice of their own not to interfere, not to stop it, because that violated some principle deeper than law, but to preserve, to save fragments, to ensure that humanity itself didn't end even if this particular civilization would. The abductions weren't experiments or cruelty, they were mercy, brutal and strange and utterly alien in its logic, but mercy nonetheless. They were taking people across time, storing them in suspension, waiting for Earth to heal itself through whatever dark centuries or millennia that would require, and then they'd return us, to a world made clean again by the absence of the species that had broken it. Lyre released my hand and I collapsed onto the barn floor, gasping, tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't say if they were from grief or revelation, or simply the overload of seeing too much truth at once. He sat beside me, tiny and luminous, and placed one small hand on my chest, over my heart, and I felt him there not just physically, but deeper, in the place where memory and identity live. Through our connection, he showed me one last thing, myself as a child, maybe 6 or 7, standing in a field at night, and Lyre there too, larger than, his hand extended to me in greeting or goodbye, and I understood with absolute certainty that this wasn't our first meeting, that he'd known me before, that whatever had happened in my childhood had been taken from my conscious memory but had lived in my body, in my dreams, in the inexplicable sense I'd carried my whole life, that I was waiting for something to return. He'd come back for me, I realized, not to take me but to explain, to give me the choice that had been made for Sarah, for the thousands sleeping in those chambers. And as I lay on the cold floor with his small hand over my racing heart, I knew that everything in my life was about to change, that the man I'd been was dissolving into someone who'd seen behind the curtain of reality, and could never unsee it. I spent the weeks after Lyre's vision in a fugue state, operating the farm on autopilot while my mind circled obsessively around that single image of myself as a child in the field. Lyre's hand extended toward me. I knew that memory was real, knew it in my bones, but it existed behind a wall in my head that I'd never questioned before. A smooth blank spot in my childhood that I'd always attributed to the trauma of Sarah's disappearance. But now I understood the blankness wasn't natural, was something imposed, and I began to dig. I started with the family photo albums my mother had left me, boxes I hadn't opened in years, and I spread them across the kitchen table, searching for proof. There, in a photograph from June of 1976, I found myself at 7 years old, standing in our backyard with a strange expression on my face, not the smile kids usually had in pictures, but a look of distant confusion, as if I'd just woken from a dream I couldn't quite remember. Behind me in the photo, barely visible at the tree line, was a reflection or aberration in the film, a spot of light that shouldn't have been there given the angle of the sun, and I knew with absolute certainty I was looking at evidence of something my child self had seen and been made to forget. I drove into town for the first time in months, to the library, where I spent hours scrolling through microfiche of the local newspaper from that summer. I found the article about Sarah's disappearance on July 4th, 1976, the details. I remembered family barbecue, 30 witnesses, child vanishes without a trace, but I also found something I'd forgotten or never knew. There had been other disappearances that year, 3 in our county alone, all children, all under circumstances that made no sense. The paper quoted a sheriff saying they suspected a predator, maybe someone traveling through, but no bodies were ever found, no suspects ever identified. And eventually the cases went cold like thousands of others across the country. I made copies of everything, my hands shaking as the machine hummed and spat out pages. And when the librarian asked if I was okay, I told her I was researching family history, which was true in a way that made my voice crack. That night I laid the articles across the floor beside Lear's sleeping form. He was so small now, aging backward into something like infancy, and I felt the weight of pattern, of design, of a strategy that had been selecting humans for preservation across generations, and I was part of it, had been marked or chosen or touched at 7 years old for reasons I still didn't understand. The memories started coming back in fragments, triggered by Lear's proximity or maybe released by my willingness to finally see them. I'd be washing dishes and suddenly remember standing in that field, the grass cold and wet against my bare feet, looking up at something massive and silent hovering above the tree line, its surface reflecting stars that weren't in the right positions. I'd be feeding the chickens and remember a room with curved walls, not frightening but strange, and beings like Lyre moving around me with purpose and gentleness, touching my head, my chest, placing something like forgiveness or reassurance into my body through their hands. I'd be lying in bed and remember Lyre himself, larger than, his luminous eyes level with mine, and the sense of being seen completely, understood in a way that 7-year-old me had never experienced, as if he was reading not just my thoughts but my potential, the person I might become across decades. The memories didn't come with sound. I couldn't remember if they'd spoken or if I'd spoken, but they came with emotion, and the dominant emotion wasn't fear, was something closer to relief, as if some part of me had been waiting my whole life to be chosen for something, and when it happened, even at 7, I'd felt less like a victim and more like someone finally called home after a long exile in a place that had never quite fit. But the memory that broke me, that finally shattered the careful isolation I'd built around my life, came on a Saturday morning when I was repairing fence posts and the smell of cedar and earth triggered something so visceral I dropped the hammer and sank to my knees in the mud. I remembered Sarah in that room with me, Sarah after she'd been taken, sitting in a chamber that glowed with soft light, and Lyre showing me she was safe, was chosen, would be preserved. I remembered understanding even at 7 that she wasn't coming home, but also that she wasn't gone, and I remembered the choice they'd given me come. I remembered the choice they'd given me come with Sarah into preservation, or return home and forget until the time was right, and I remembered choosing to go back, because Mom was crying somewhere beyond that room and I couldn't bear the thought of her losing both of us. That memory sat in my chest like a stone for days, too heavy to examine, too significant to ignore, and it was Lyre who finally helped me understand its full meaning. He was so small by then, perhaps the size of a toddler, his luminous eyes taking up most of his face, and when he reached for my hand one evening as I sat beside his makeshift bed in the barn, I felt the now familiar warmth of his communication flowing into me, but this time it came with clarity rather than images, as if he'd been waiting for me to remember enough to finally comprehend the truth. What flooded into my consciousness wasn't abduction, wasn't violation or experiment or any of the nightmare scenarios that had dominated UFO lore for decades. It was rescue, deliberate and systematic, a project spanning generations and continents, his people moving through time as easily as I moved through space, selecting humans based on criteria I still couldn't fully grasp, but that seemed to involve potential, genetic diversity, and something he communicated as resonance, a quality of consciousness that could adapt to what was coming. The humans taken weren't being studied, they were being saved, held in suspension across time itself in vast chambers aboard ships that existed partially outside normal space, waiting in dreamless sleep for a world that would be safe again. Lyre showed me the catastrophe through sensation rather than image. I felt the Earth's fever, the cascading collapse of systems my generation had set in motion, without fully understanding the momentum we'd created, the tipping points already passed by the time I was born. I felt oceans rising and forests burning, and the intricate web of life that had taken millions of years to evolve unraveling in a span so brief it barely registered in geological time. And I understood that his people, perceiving time non-linearly, had watched this happen from outside our timeline, had seen the moment of collapse approaching like a wave, that couldn't be stopped, only survived by those who could be lifted above it, the abductions, the missing children and adults who became statistics and cold cases and lifelong mysteries for their families. They were acts of mercy, violations of their own laws against interference, because the alternative was extinction, the permanent loss of a species they'd been observing for millennia and had deemed worth saving despite our flaws. Liar communicated grief for the deception, for the trauma inflicted on those left behind, the mothers like mine who spent lifetimes searching for children who were safe but unreachable. And I felt his people's debate across centuries, the terrible calculus of choosing to save thousands while leaving billions to face the consequences of choices they'd inherited from previous generations. The preservation wasn't random, it was an arc built across time, and people like Sarah, like the children who'd disappeared from my county in 1976, like countless others spanning decades, were already aboard, suspended in a sleep that felt instantaneous to them, waiting to wake in a world centuries or millennia ahead after the Earth had healed itself the way it had after previous extinctions. The knowledge should have devastated me, should have sent me into despair or rage, but instead I felt a strange calm settling over my bones, the way you feel when a suspicion you've carried your whole life is finally confirmed. I'd known, hadn't I, on some level beneath language, known that the world was ending slowly, known that my generation's comfortable denial was a luxury bought with our descendants' future, known that the increasing strangeness of weather and extinction and societal fracture wasn't cyclical but terminal. Liar had given me the gift of certainty, had removed the burden of hope that things might somehow correct themselves if we just recycled more or voted better or prayed harder, and in its place he'd offered something more valuable: purpose, and the knowledge that humanity wouldn't end completely, that some thread of us would persist. I thought about Sarah waking up centuries from now in a body that hadn't aged a day past 9 years old, stepping out onto an Earth rewilded and rebalanced, joining others who'd been saved from different eras, building something new from the preserved seeds of the old world. And I understood why Lear's people had considered this mercy worth the cost of interference. The families left behind became martyrs to a future they'd never see, their grief the price paid for species survival. And I was caught between both sides of that equation, a child who'd been offered preservation and chosen to return, now an adult living in the shadow of the catastrophe those preserved souls would outlast. That night I sat on my porch watching the stars, Lyra asleep inside the barn, and I tried to calculate how much time I had left, how long before the tipping point became free fall. But Lyra hadn't given me dates, only the certainty that it was coming within my natural lifetime. I thought about my neighbors in town, the young families shopping at the hardware store, the kids riding bikes down Main Street, all of them living in the brief window between ignorance and collapse, and I felt a helplessness so profound it stopped being painful and became almost peaceful. There was nothing I could do with this knowledge, no way to warn anyone that wouldn't sound like madness, no action I could take that would alter the trajectory of systems already in motion. I was being given the truth not so I could change anything, but so I could choose how to spend the time remaining. Lyre had shown me this, I realized, not as cruelty but as gift, the same gift his people had tried to give humanity for decades through contactees and abductees who returned with fragmented memories and warnings no one believed. The difference was that I had context, had Lyre himself as proof and translator, and now I had to decide what to do with a truth that could either poison my remaining years with dread or liberate me to live them fully, knowing they were finite in a way that transcended normal mortality and encompassed everything I'd ever known. They came on a January night so cold the stars looked sharp enough to cut, riving, without sound or light in the way Lear's kind moved through space. And I knew they were there before I saw them because Lyre began to tremble in a way I'd never witnessed, his small body going rigid with what I recognized as fear. I'd been reading by the wood stove, Lyre curled on his cushion near the heat, and when he suddenly sat upright with his luminous eyes fixed on the barn door, I felt my stomach drop with the certainty that our isolated peace was ending. 3 of them materialized in the doorway without opening it, taller than Lyre had ever been, their presence filling the barn with a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges, and I understood immediately that these were not rescuers or healers but something closer to judges, their attention fixed on Lyre with an intensity that felt like accusation. Lyre moved in front of me despite his fragile size, a gesture so instinctively protective it broke something in my chest. and I watched as communication passed between them in ways I couldn't perceive, rapid exchanges of meaning that left Liar shrinking further into himself, his glow dimming like a lamp running out of oil. The largest of the three finally turned its attention to me, and when our eyes met I felt the full force of its consciousness pressing against mine, ancient and vast and completely without the warmth I'd grown accustomed to from Liar, assessing me with the clinical detachment of an entomologist examining an insect that had wandered into the wrong habitat. What came through wasn't language but pure meaning, flowing into my mind with crushing clarity. Liar had violated their most fundamental law, the principle of non-attachment that governed all interaction with species. Under observation, and by staying with me, by forming a bond that transcended his mission, he had compromised not only himself but the entire preservation project. I felt their perspective flood through me, how Lear's decision to remain and heal here rather than returning to his vessel had created a thread of connection that could be traced, how our bond had become visible to those who watched for such violations, and how there existed among Lear's people a faction who believed the preservation project was itself a violation, that humanity should be allowed to face the consequences of its choices without interference, that mercy toward a self-destructive species was illogical and dangerous. These three were not from that faction, but they existed in a political reality I could barely comprehend, one that spanned time streams and consensus decisions that took decades to form, and Lear's transgression had given the opposition exactly the evidence they needed to argue that emotional attachment to humans compromised judgment, that the preservation project should be abandoned and humanity allowed to go extinct naturally. The weight of it crashed over me, that our friendship, this impossible bond that had given meaning to my isolation, had become ammunition in a debate about whether my entire species deserved to survive, and that both Liar and I were now in danger from those who would rather see the preservation end than allow exceptions to their laws. Liar was communicating desperately with them, his small form shaking with effort, and though I couldn't understand the exchange, I felt its emotional content pleading justification, a defense of his choice that seemed to fall on consciousness too vast and cold to be swayed by individual attachment. One of the beings moved closer to me, and I forced myself not to retreat, meeting its enormous eyes even as my hindbrain screamed at me to run. And what it showed me then was threat wrapped in inevitability. The faction opposed to preservation was already moving through their decision-making processes, using Lear's violation as proof that emotional contamination made the project untenable. And if they succeeded in building consensus, the ships holding thousands of suspended humans would be emptied. The sleepers returned to their original timelines to face the extinction. Their descendants would not survive. Sarah would be sent back to 1976, along with all the others saved across decades, delivered to their families with suppressed memories and no protection from what was coming. The entire arc dismantled, because one being had stayed too long with one human and proved that attachment corrupted purpose. I felt rage then, pure and clarifying, at the cosmic injustice of it, that love, the thing I'd thought most human, existed in Lear's kind too, and was considered dangerous enough to condemn thousands to death, that our friendship could be used as evidence that mercy itself was flawed, that the choice to care was somehow proof of weakness rather than strength. The three beings turned their attention back to Liar, and I felt rather than heard their ultimatum. He would return with them immediately to face judgment, and I would be given the suppression treatment, my memories of the past years erased, Lear's presence in my life reduced to missing time and vague unease, or we could both refuse and be classified as compromised, marked for termination by the faction who already wanted the preservation ended. I watched Lear's glow pulse erratically, his child-sized form caught between surrender and defiance, and I made my decision in the space between heartbeats, stepping forward and placing myself physically between Liar and the three judges, knowing it was absurd, that my human body meant nothing to beings who could unmake me with a thought, but needing them to understand that whatever happened next, they would have to go through me first. My voice came out steady, despite the fear flooding my system, and I spoke aloud knowing they would understand, meaning if not words. He stays with me, or you take us both, but I won't let you erase what we've built here, and I won't let you use our friendship as an excuse to abandon thousands of people who trusted you to save them. The barn filled with something like surprise, consciousness brushing against consciousness, and in Lear's eyes I saw both terror and something that looked like hope, fragile as spring ice, as we waited together to learn whether love was crime enough to doom us both, or proof that some things transcended even the oldest laws. The largest of the three beings shifted its attention fully onto me, and what flooded into my consciousness then wasn't threat, but something far more destabilizing context. The complete architecture of truth I'd only glimpsed in fragments through Lear's carefully rationed visions. I saw the abductions as they truly were. Not violations but evacuations. A mercy project spanning centuries conducted by beings whose perception of time allowed them to see the approaching collapse as clearly as I could see the sunset, witnessing humanity's extinction playing out across probability streams like a film they'd watched 10,000 times, each iteration ending in the same suffocating darkness. They showed me what was coming with a clarity that made my knees buckle. Not asteroids or war, but something we were doing to ourselves with such slow determination we couldn't recognize it as suicide. The atmospheric tipping points and cascading system failures that would render Earth uninhabitable within 2 generations. A death not dramatic enough for movies, but absolute enough to end everything. The humans in those suspended chambers weren't specimens or prisoners, but refugees saved from a catastrophe they would never consciously know was coming, plucked from their timelines at carefully calculated moments and held in stasis not for study, but for survival. An ark built not of wood, but of time itself, designed to carry humanity's remnant forward across the centuries until Earth healed enough to sustain life again. Sarah wasn't taken from me in 1976 as punishment or curiosity, but because she'd been identified as genetically viable, psychologically resilient, someone who could help rebuild when the preserved ones were finally awakened in a world scoured, clean and beginning again. And the hole her absence left in my life was the price of her distant survival. A trade I'd never been given the chance to accept or refuse. The enormity of it pressed against my understanding that the terror and mystery shrouding abductions for generations was camouflage for an act of systematic compassion, that the missing time and suppressed memories were kindness rather than cruelty, protecting people from the unbearable knowledge that they'd been saved while everyone they loved remained behind to die. I felt the weight of their terrible mathematics, the cold equations that determined who could be preserved and who had to be left, not based on worthiness but on genetic diversity, and psychological profiles that predicted who could endure the trauma of waking centuries hence to a world empty of their species, surrounded by strangers who'd also been pulled from time and expected to build civilization from collective grief and hope. They showed me the ships, vast networks of them positioned outside linear time, holding not hundreds, but thousands of humans in suspension, pulled from every decade since they'd begun the project in the early 20th century, a genetic and cultural cross-section of humanity preserved like seeds in a vault against the winter they knew was coming. And I understood then why Lear's violation was so dangerous, not because our friendship was somehow corrupting him, but because knowledge of the preservation project couldn't spread among humans still living there. Linear lives couldn't become hope or conspiracy or religion, because if people knew rescue was possible they would wait for salvation instead of fighting to prevent the catastrophe. And the beings running this mercy mission understood that their intervention had to remain invisible or it would become the very thing that guaranteed humanity's passivity in the face of extinction. Hope transformed into the final nail in our coffin. But more than the mechanics of preservation, they showed me the cost their own people bore for this project, the philosophical schism it had created among beings who experienced time as a landscape rather than a river, who could see all outcomes simultaneously and had to choose which futures to honor. The faction opposing preservation wasn't cruel, but principled in their own terrible way, believing that to interfere with a species' natural trajectory even to save them was to rob them of authenticity, to turn them into pets or exhibits rather than allowing them the dignity of facing consequences. And that Lear's attachment to me proved their point, demonstrated that you couldn't save a species without becoming entangled with individuals. An individual attachment inevitably corrupted the vast cold clarity needed to make decisions about entire timelines. I felt the weight of their debate, arguments that had raged for what translated to centuries in their perception, the opposition growing stronger as they pointed to cases like Lear's as evidence that the preservation project had become about the preserver's emotional needs rather than humanity's objective benefit, that beings who spent too long among humans began to value individual lives over species survival, mercy over mathematics, and that this contamination of purpose would eventually compromise everything they'd built. They were asking me to understand what my friendship with Liar had cost, not in punishment but in political reality. That our bond had become a weapon in the hands of those who wanted to empty the ships and abandon humanity to its fate, and that the choice now wasn't just about Lear's violation, but about whether the entire preservation project would survive the scandal of one being who'd stayed too long and cared too much. The being's consciousness withdrew slightly, giving me space to process, and in that space I felt Lear's small hand slip into mine, his luminous eyes fixed on my face with an expression I'd learned to read over 10 years of silent communication, apology and defiance braided together. Sorry for the danger he'd brought to my door, but not sorry for staying. Not sorry for the bond we'd forged in this barn. While the world outside continued its oblivious march toward extinction, I looked at the three judges, these ancient beings who'd taken on the unbearable burden of deciding which humans deserved a future, and I understood finally what they were offering in this moment: not just judgment but choice. The same choice they'd given Sarah and thousands of others. Though mine came with full consciousness of its weight and meaning, they could take me now, add me to the preserved, let me sleep through the dying, and wake in the distant green future where Sarah and the others would emerge to rebuild on an earth that had forgotten humanity's first failure. Or they could leave me here with Liar if he chose to stay, to violations against the law of non-attachment, living out our natural spans while the political battle over preservation raged in spaces I couldn't comprehend. Our continued existence either ammunition for the opposition or proof that some bonds transcended even the most carefully constructed laws. In Lear's eyes I saw the question he'd been carrying since he first understood his own transgression. Was our friendship worth the risk? 2000s. Was individual love enough to gamble against species survival? And could I forgive him if the answer turned out to be no? If his choice to stay with me became the thing that doomed the preservation project and sent all those sleeping humans back to die with everyone else? I squeezed his hand gently, feeling the delicate bones beneath, skin that glowed like foxfire, and knew that whatever I chose next would ripple forward through time in ways I couldn't predict. That this moment in a freezing Montana barn had somehow become a hinge point in the vast debate about whether humanity deserved mercy, and that the three beings watching us were waiting to see if love could justify itself in the face of extinction, or if it was just another form of entropy, beautiful and doomed and ultimately meaningless against the mathematics of survival. I looked at Liar, really looked at him in the silver light emanating from the three beings, and saw not the mysterious creature I'd found broken in my barn, but the impossible friend who'd taught me to read the language of seasons and stars, who'd sat with me through countless silent evenings while I grieved a wife whose absence finally made terrible sense, who'd chosen relationship over duty and individual love over the cold mathematics of species survival. And I knew my answer before the question fully formed. I'm staying, I said aloud, my voice rough in the charged air, and felt Lear's hand tighten in mine even as something like sorrow moved across his luminous features, because he understood before I explained what staying meant, what I was refusing and why. I directed my next words to the three judges, to the vast consciousness behind their physical forms. I'm grateful, more than I can express, for what you've tried to do for us, for Sarah, for all the others sleeping in your ships. But I can't abandon this world while it's still breathing, can't step into preservation while there's even the smallest chance that knowledge might make a difference. The largest being's attention intensified, and I felt their question without words. What difference could one human with forbidden knowledge possibly make against the momentum of catastrophe? What was my plan except to die slightly more informed than my neighbors? I don't have a plan, I admitted, and the honesty of it felt like freedom. But Liar taught me something these past 10 years that matters more than plans. He taught me that time isn't the straight line we think it is, that cause and effect can loop back on themselves in ways we don't understand, and that the act of caring, of choosing relationship over logic, has weight beyond what we can measure. I felt their curiosity, these beings who'd been arguing for centuries about the ethics of intervention, and I pressed forward with the only truth I had to offer. You're debating whether individual attachment corrupts your mission, whether Lear's choice to stay with me proves that preservation requires distance and objectivity. But what if you're asking the wrong question? What if the act of preservation isn't diminished by attachment, but completed by it? What if the humans you're saving need more than biological survival? They need to wake up knowing they were valued as individuals, not just as genetic material or breeding stock. I thought of Sarah in her suspension chamber, thought of her waking centuries hence to a scoured earth surrounded by strangers, and felt my heart break and mend simultaneously with understanding. The reason I'm choosing to stay isn't because I don't believe in your mission. It's because your mission needs witnesses here. People who know what you're doing and choose to honor it by living differently. By planting trees I'll never see mature and fighting for a future I won't inhabit. By making the act of faith tangible in a world that's forgotten how to. Hope beyond quarterly profits and election cycles. Liar was trembling now, his small body radiating something between grief and recognition. And I realized he'd been trying to tell me this, all along through his drawings and visions, that his violation wasn't just personal but philosophical. A living argument that mercy required relationship. That you couldn't save beings you refused to know as individuals. The three beings conferred in that space beyond language, and I felt the weight of their deliberation. The way my choice was being examined not just for its immediate meaning, but for its implications, across the vast timeline of their project. Finally, the largest one directed a narrow beam of consciousness toward me, and what came through was something unexpected: respect. Recognition that I'd understood the true stakes and chosen according to a logic they could honor, even if it wasn't their own. They showed me then what staying would mean, not just death when the catastrophe came, but years of carrying unbearable knowledge, watching the world slide toward the tipping point while being unable to explain what I knew, without sounding insane or compromising the preservation project's secrecy, the isolation of being awake, among the sleepwalking. But they also showed me the possibility I'd intuited that witness had, power, that conscious faith in an invisible future could plant seeds in ways that transcended individual survival, that the forest I intended to grow on my land might become something more than trees, might become a symbol or sanctuary or unexpected variable in the complex equations of catastrophe and recovery, that even their non-linear perception couldn't fully predict what one human's informed choice might generate across time. We'll take Liar home, the being communicated, and I felt Lear's small hand grip mine with desperate strength. But we'll remember your choice, and we'll make sure those we preserve know that some stayed behind by choice, that your world wasn't simply abandoned, but held in the hearts of those who chose to remain, that the future they wake to was purchased partly by people like you, who planted forests in the dying time. The final moment came too quickly and not quickly enough. Liar standing before me as the three beings prepared their departure, his luminous eyes meeting mine with an expression I'd learned to read as love, complex and alien but unmistakably real, the bond we'd forged stronger than the laws he'd broken to maintain it. He reached up and touched my face with both small hands, and a final vision flooded through me, not of ships or catastrophe, but of a distant morning centuries ahead when humans would emerge from preservation into a world gone wild and healing, when they'd find this land I was going to plant and recognize it as message, as promise, as proof that they'd been loved enough to save and remembered by those who'd stayed behind. And among them would be Sarah, older than time but young in her awakened body, walking through trees I'd planted with my own hands, and somehow, impossibly, in the non-linear way his people experienced existence. Liar would be there too, would watch her discover this place and understand finally what it meant, and that understanding would ripple forward through the rebuilding, would inform how the preserved ones approached their second chance. He stepped back, and I let him go, tears freezing on my face in the Montana cold, and watched as the three beings and Liar dissolved into light that rose through the barn roof, and vanished into stars that suddenly seemed less distant, and I stood alone in the silence they left behind, broken and whole simultaneously, carrying the weight of extinction and the lightness of purpose, ready to begin the work of planting faith in a future I'd never see but had finally learned to believe in. The years that followed were both harder and simpler than I'd imagined, stripped down to essentials that gave each season clarity and purpose. I bought every adjoining acre I could afford and some I couldn't, taking loans I'd never repay, assembling a patchwork of 400 acres that the bank thought I was ranching, but that I knew in my bones was something else entirely, something between cemetery and cradle. I planted trees with the methodology Liar had taught me through our years together, reading the land's subtle languages, understanding which species would nurture the soil for the next wave and which would stand sentinel through centuries of climate chaos before the healing came. Oak and cedar, pine and aspen, creating diversity that could adapt and endure. And with each sapling I set into earth I whispered the names I remembered from Lear's visions, the preserved ones sleeping in their suspension chambers, making the act of planting also an act of prayer for people I'd never meet who'd wake to walk among these giants. The work gave shape to days that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of knowledge, I couldn't share, and I developed a reputation in town as the eccentric who'd gone tree mad after his wife disappeared, which was closer to truth than anyone knew and gave me the privacy that grief affords. I didn't try to warn people or change the trajectory I'd been shown, understanding that the catastrophe was already in motion, its seeds planted generations before and choices normalized as progress, and that my role wasn't prevention but preparation of a different kind, tending the symbolic ground that would matter more than anyone living could comprehend. The loneliness was profound but not complete, because once you've learned to read the patterns Liar taught me, you're never quite alone in nature. I saw the conversations between soil and root, the negotiations between predator and prey, the way the forest I was growing began to develop its own consciousness, not sentient, in the way humans measured but aware in the deeper sense, responsive to the intention I poured into every planted row. Sometimes at dusk I'd walk the expanding woods and feel certain I wasn't the only one tending them, that Lear's people were somehow present in the liminal spaces, watching over this experiment in faith made physical, though I never saw them again after that night they took him home. I found myself talking to Sarah as I worked, explaining what I was doing and why, apologizing for choosing to stay when I might have joined her in preservation, hoping she'd understand when she woke that my staying was its own kind of love, a recognition that she deserved to return to a world that hadn't been entirely abandoned, where someone had maintained vigil and belief. The signs of accelerating collapse that the beings had shown me began manifesting in small ways that most people rationalized or ignored. Temperature records broken then broken again. Migration patterns disrupted. The intricate systems that sustained civilization fraying in ways that wouldn't become undeniable until it was far too late. And I planted through it all with the steady rhythm of a man who'd accepted his role in a drama spanning centuries, finding strange peace in the knowledge that failure and success were measured on timescales beyond my lifespan. In my 73rd year, as cancer began its quiet claims on my body, I planted the final trees in the pattern Liar had shown me, completing a design that wouldn't be visible from ground level, but that I knew from the visions would be unmistakable from above, a message in living wood that said someone here understood, someone maintained faith, someone honored the covenant between the preserved and those who'd stayed behind. I'd arranged for the land to transfer to a conservation trust with restrictions that would outlive the catastrophe, legally protecting it in terms my era understood, while secretly preserving it for the purpose only I knew, a bridge between worlds and times. The pain in my bones was considerable, but felt earned, the price of having lived when I might have chosen escape, and I didn't regret it even in the worst nights when mortality felt less like abstract future and more like a wolf circling closer. I thought often of Liar growing smaller, moving backward through his strange life cycle, wondered if he'd reached whatever beginning his kind returned to, hoped that his people hadn't punished him too severely for the violation that had saved me from a different kind of death, the death of living without purpose or understanding. On the final morning, I walked the forest one last time, running my hands along bark of trees that were already taller than me, that would be giants when Sarah woke, and I felt the presence of something vast and patient acknowledging my work, the consciousness behind the preservation recognizing that I'd kept my promise, had planted faith where only endings seemed possible. They found me 3 days later beneath the oldest oak, and the few who came to the funeral assumed I'd simply been another lonely man who'd retreated from the world after loss, not understanding that I'd done the opposite, had advanced toward a future I'd never inhabit, but had helped prepare with the only tools one possessed: hands, hope, and the impossible knowledge that love could span centuries if you were willing to plant it deep enough and trust the roots to hold. The forest grew through the collapse years and the long silence after, survived the catastrophes that erased cities and reconfigured continents, endured because I'd chosen the right species in the right combinations with guidance from beings who perceived time as landscape rather than arrow. And when they finally woke, the preserved ones, when Sarah emerged with thousands of others into a world transformed beyond recognition, struggling to understand what had happened and why they'd been chosen, and what was expected of them now, someone noticed the forest from above, saw the pattern, understood it was deliberate, and realized with the force of revelation that they hadn't been simply stored, but honored, that someone had stayed behind and worked in faith of their return, and that recognition changed something fundamental in how the awakened ones approached their second chance, made them custodians rather than colonizers of the healing world. And in that shift, In that choice informed by the message I'd planted, Lear's violation and my decision and the trees we'd conspired to grow together justified themselves across the vast mathematics of consequence, proving that mercy required witness and that the smallest acts of faith could hold the weight of centuries if you were willing to plant them deep enough and trust the future to understand. What would you choose if you knew the world was ending but could plant something for those who'd survive? Subscribe to hear more stories that bridge the impossible and the human.